The erasure of Black history from books and historical records is a complex and calculated process that has unfolded over centuries. This deliberate act was not merely an oversight or an accidental omission. It was a conscious effort by various powerful entities to control narratives, sustain systems of oppression, and perpetuate ideologies of racial superiority. This video will explore the historical, social, and political dimensions of why Black history was deliberately erased, the impacts of this erasure on the collective consciousness of society, and the ongoing efforts to reclaim and reconstruct the histories that were lost or hidden. The roots of Black history erasure can be traced back to the period of European colonial expansion and the transatlantic slave trade, which laid the groundwork for systemic racial discrimination. During the 15th to 19th centuries, European powers colonized vast portions of Africa and enslaved millions of Africans, transporting them to the Americas. This period marked the beginning of a concerted effort to justify the dehumanization of Black people through intellectual, religious, and pseudoscientific means. European colonial powers were driven by economic and political motives to control African resources and labor. As part of this project, they systematically downplayed or ignored the rich and diverse histories of African civilizations. African kingdoms such as Mali, Songhai, Kush, and Great Zimbabwe had rich cultural, political, and intellectual traditions that rivaled those of Europe and Asia. However, European colonizers sought to portray Africa as a dark continent, devoid of history, culture, or civilization. This narrative provided a convenient justification for the exploitation and domination of African people. European intellectuals, writers, and historians either erased or distorted the historical records of these civilizations in order to legitimize their colonial endeavors. Colonial authorities also engaged in the deliberate destruction of African historical artifacts and records. Oral traditions, which were integral to African societies, were often dismissed as untrustworthy or primitive, while written records were destroyed or looted. This act of historical violence ensured that future generations would have limited access to their ancestral heritage. The suppression of African history was, therefore, an essential tool for maintaining colonial control. The rise of scientific racism in the 18th and 19th centuries provided further ideological justifications for the erasure of Black history. European thinkers such as Immanuel Kant, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and others posited theories of racial hierarchy that placed Black people at the bottom of a supposed racial order. Hegel famously declared that Africa had no history prior to European contact, stating, "Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit." These ideas were widely disseminated and embedded into the intellectual fabric of Western societies, shaping the way historians, anthropologists, and writers approached the study of Africa and its people. In academic circles, the study of African history was often neglected or viewed through the lens of European superiority. The idea that Africa was a blank slate, waiting to be civilized by European powers, became a pervasive myth that underpinned colonialism and justified the continued oppression of Black people. In the United States, the erasure of Black history was similarly driven by the need to maintain the institution of slavery and later, the system of racial segregation. Enslaved Africans brought to America had their cultural and historical ties to Africa deliberately severed. They were often prohibited from learning to read or write, making it difficult for them to record their own histories. Plantation owners and pro-slavery advocates propagated the myth that Africans had no history or civilization worth preserving, reinforcing the notion that they were inherently inferior and destined for servitude. Following the abolition of slavery, the erasure of Black history continued in new forms. During the Jim Crow era, public education in the South was segregated, and Black students were denied access to comprehensive and accurate historical education. Textbooks used in Southern schools often glorified the Confederacy, minimized the horrors of slavery, and ignored the contributions of Black Americans to the nation's development. This systematic distortion of history ensured that Black people remained marginalized, and that white supremacy was upheld as a dominant ideology. Eurocentrism, the belief in the inherent superiority of European culture and history, played a central role in the erasure of Black history. From the Renaissance onward, European scholars and writers increasingly viewed their own culture as the pinnacle of human achievement. They positioned Europe as the center of the world's intellectual, cultural, and political life, while relegating non-European peoples to the margins of history. This Eurocentric worldview dominated academic institutions, museums, and libraries, where the writing of history was concentrated. European historians and archaeologists often focused on their own civilizations and downplayed or ignored the achievements of non-European societies. When Africa was studied, it was often done through a colonial lens that emphasized European conquest and civilizing missions rather than the agency and achievements of African peoples. For centuries, the achievements of Black civilizations were deliberately excluded from historical accounts. For example, the ancient kingdom of Kush, which had a highly advanced culture and even ruled Egypt during the 25th dynasty, was often downplayed or dismissed as a footnote in Egyptian history. The great West African empires of Mali and Songhai, which were centers of learning, commerce, and culture, were similarly neglected in favor of narratives that emphasized European exploration and conquest. This Eurocentric bias was not limited to Africa. The history of the African diaspora, particularly in the Americas, was also systematically erased. The contributions of enslaved Africans to the development of the Americas were often overlooked, while the violence and brutality of the transatlantic slave trade were downplayed. Black leaders, intellectuals, and activists were either ignored or vilified in mainstream historical narratives. As a result, many people of African descent grew up without a clear understanding of their own history or the rich legacy of their ancestors. The deliberate erasure of Black history was facilitated by the control of historical narratives by powerful institutions, including governments, educational systems, and religious organizations. In many cases, these institutions had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and suppressing alternative historical accounts that challenged their authority. Colonial governments, for example, often controlled the production of history through their influence over education and publishing. In colonial Africa, schools were primarily run by missionaries and colonial administrators, who taught a version of history that glorified European achievements and ignored or minimized African contributions. Textbooks used in these schools often portrayed Africa as a land of savagery and chaos, in need of European intervention. Similarly, in the United States, state governments controlled the content of public education, particularly in the South. During the Jim Crow era, Black students were systematically denied access to accurate historical education. History textbooks used in Southern schools glorified the Confederacy, downplayed the horrors of slavery, and ignored the contributions of Black Americans. Even after the Civil Rights Movement, many states continued to resist efforts to include Black history in school curricula, and the legacy of these exclusionary practices continues to affect education today. Religious institutions also played a role in the erasure of Black history, particularly during the colonial period. Christian missionaries often sought to convert African peoples to Christianity, and in doing so, they frequently dismissed or demonized indigenous African religions and cultural practices. Missionaries often presented African history and culture as primitive and barbaric, reinforcing colonial ideologies of European superiority. This religious framing further legitimized the erasure of African history in the eyes of European and American audiences. Despite the widespread and systematic erasure of Black history, efforts to reclaim and reconstruct these narratives have persisted over centuries. African historians, intellectuals, activists, and artists have long resisted the erasure of their heritage and have fought to preserve their cultural and historical memory. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, African-American scholars such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, and others worked tirelessly to document and publicize the history of Black people in America and Africa. Du Bois, in particular, was a leading figure in the Pan-African movement, which sought to unite people of African descent worldwide and highlight the shared history and experiences of Black people across the globe. Carter G. Woodson, known as the father of Black history, founded Negro History Week in 1926, which later became Black History Month. Woodson's goal was to raise awareness about the contributions of Black people to American and global history and to challenge the dominant historical narratives that marginalize their experiences. His work laid the foundation for the study of Black history in academic institutions and public life. In Africa, nationalist movements of the mid-20th century also emphasized the importance of reclaiming African history. Leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Julius Nyerere in Tanzania stressed the need to reconnect with Africa's pre-colonial past and celebrate its cultural heritage as part of the struggle for independence. In recent decades, scholars from Africa and the African diaspora have continued to challenge Eurocentric narratives and bring to light the rich and diverse histories of Black people around the world. Fields such as African history, African American history, and Africana studies have gained greater prominence in academic institutions, and there has been a growing recognition of the need to decolonize historical knowledge.